Good morning, all. It was so great to have this music beforehand. It's been really a joy to sing with you before these sessions as well. I have a poem to start us with. This is called Local Heroes by Thomas Lynch. Some days the worst that can happen happens. The sky falls, or weather overwhelms, or the world, as we have come to know it, turns toward the eventual apocalypse, long prefigured in all the holy books, the end times of floods and conflagrations that bring us to the edge of our oblivions. Still, maybe this is not the end at all, nor even the beginning of the end. Rather, one more in a long list of sorrows to be added to the ones thus far endured through what we have come to call our history. Another in that bitter litany that we will, if we survive it, have survived. Lord, in our peril, send us local heroes, someone to listen, someone to watch, someone to search and wait and keep the careful count of the dead and missing, the dead and gone, but not forgotten. Sometimes all that can be done is to salvage one sadness from the mass of sadnesses, to bear one body home, to lay the dead out among their people, organize the flowers and casseroles, write the obits, meet the mourners at the door, drive the dark procession through town, toll the bell, dig the hole, tend the pyre. It's what we do. The day-long news is dire, full of true believers and politicos, old talk of race and blame and photo ops. But here, brave men and women pick the pieces up. They serve the living, tending to the dead. They bring them home, the missing and adrift. They give them back to let them go again. Like politics, all funerals are local. So in May of 2019, a cluster of powerful tornadoes struck Dayton, Ohio. And these tornadoes, it was like they had an evil mind. They brought the worst damage to the neighborhoods that could least withstand it, to areas that were already economically depressed, already struggling. Everyone was shaken. No lives were lost, miraculously, but the whole community was quite shaken by this. So in the aftermath, there was an outpouring of response. This is an instinctual response to things that happened. Barrels were put out at our local community center to collect diapers and socks, and all the banks put out little boxes so that people can make monetary donations. Schools and libraries opened up as day shelters where people could get snacks and water and charge their phones. Teams of people, probably some of you here, drove in from outside and helped to clean up those neighborhoods and helped people to put their lives back together. So these instinctual actions that are directed toward easing the pain of others also have a beneficial response within the one who is offering that act of service or care. And Kata Weingarten describes these responses as acts of compassionate witness. And when they're done with intention, these concrete actions of blessing can really help, I think, to ease traumatic stress in our world. So that's what I'm going to be looking at with you guys today. We're going to look at compassionate witnessing and some of Kata Weingarten's work, and then look at how prayer can be part of our toolkit of response in the aftermath of trauma, and not even just intense trauma, but kind of the glancing blows of what it means to be human. So if you Google Kata Weingarten and Witnessing Project, you can find, you don't have to do it right now, but you can find, she's one of these wonderful scholars who puts all of her articles on her website, and there's like no paywalls, so you can access a lot of this work and kind of dive in as deeply as you want to. But she uses the term common shock to describe what it is to live in a world where we experience many like everyday small violations, acts of violence, glancing blows, things that are at an arm's length, like that's not impacting me directly, but it is impacting the world, and so it's impacting me in kind of like the way that you throw a rock into a stream and you experience kind of the ripples or the reverberations. And she's seeking to transform toxic witnessing, which, as you can imagine from the term, is basically when you ignore the response that your body has to these kinds of events, and kind of you try to numb yourself out, or you talk yourself out of whatever feeling you're having, to compassionate witness, which is where you listen to what the response that you're having and seek to do something with intention to kind of lean into that response that you're having. So trying to stay present rather than going numb and checking out, or just sort of absorbing it and moving on with your day. And I feel like this idea of compassion is really key. And in the Hebrew scriptures, the word that is used for the compassion of God is related to the word for God's womb. So it's really the sense of God's womb being pained in solidarity with us. And I love this because it's bodily, it's generative. There's a sense in which God's compassion yields something, it bears fruit. So compassionate witness is being intentionally present to those who have experienced trauma, and it builds on this sense of common human resonance. And this is probably one of the most beneficial tools in these years where I've been exploring and researching about trauma and resilience, to know that I have a choice when I experience these kind of glancing blows in my life. And I mean, these things happen to us all the time. Like, you look down at your phone and a disturbing headline just flits across it. Or you see something, you see an altercation happening in the grocery store between a parent and a child. Or you accidentally run over a squirrel on your way to work. These things, like, you absorb them over time, and you do have a choice as to whether you kind of ignore it and move on, or whether you just pause and attend to what rises within you. And to know that it is normal and it is okay for a person to hurt when any other being suffers. And it doesn't even have to be, it can be even creation suffering. When any other part of creation suffers, it is really normal for you to also kind of experience that response. And so compassionate witness then relates to the context of the hurt, and it cares for what I'm calling a collateral wound in ourselves. So here are some guidelines for creating an act of compassionate witness. And again, even though I'm kind of parsing this out, you don't have to overthink this. A lot of these things happen instinctually. And so then if you notice that these things are happening instinctually, to just kind of bless it and be intentional around it so that you can honor and like amplify what's happening. So the first thing that you want is, so you experience this glancing blow and you feel this sense of common shock. Common because it happens all the time, and common because we are holding life in common with whoever has experienced this primary wound. So you want a reasonable focus. So obviously, the horrible earthquake that unfolded in Syria and Turkey, I cannot go there and dig through rubble. Like, that is not a reasonable focus of response for me. But I can potentially give money to a relief agency that is equipped to go there and provide what is needed. So think about what is a reasonable response to have. Then carefully listen, like gather information. And it's hard to do that when you're feeling this kind of sense of common shock. But try to slow down your response as much as possible and say, okay, what is needed in this situation? What is not going to contribute to the burden that those who have experienced something terrible are already experiencing? And then you come up with a literal or symbolic action that attends to the need. So like after the tornadoes in Dayton, people gave water, people gave diapers, people gave things that were needed by those people. That was a literal response. If I sat in my office at school, this is also a valid response, and lit a candle and prayed for those neighborhoods, that's also a response. It's more of a symbolic response. So you can listen, and it depends upon the situation what the response is, but it doesn't have to be one and done either. Often when I experience these glancing blows, I'll be like, okay, this is bothering me. I'm just gonna stop and say a little prayer, or just release, or even just take a moment to just honor that this has happened. And then I may do something else later, a literal response or another thing later, but just to kind of attend to that in myself so it doesn't accumulate over the course of the day. Groups like NA and AA have been doing this for a long time. So if you've got recovery ministries in your settings, like listening to those communities, they are experts in kind of attending, like what does it mean to make an amend? Sometimes it has to be a symbolic amend. What does it mean to attend to those long wounds that people have been carrying? So here's some examples. So donations to the charity supported by Damar Hamlin after his collapse and cardiac arrest. Many people saw that. This again is something that happened at arm's length for most of us, but it was very troubling for millions of people. And so as a response, people gave money to this charity that he cares about. After Kobe Bryant's death, players silently allowed the shot clock to count down for 24 seconds for Bryant's number 24. So that's a symbolic response. It's acknowledging the wound that everyone had experienced with his sudden death. And again, after the tornadoes ripped through Dayton, people collected socks and diapers and bottled water. This is a literal response to the action. My brother and sister-in-law live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it was extremely troubling for locals. The deadly white supremacist rally, which really took over an area that was largely like a family-friendly, widely used pedestrian mall where there's like ice cream shops and stores and a farmer's market. Like that's what's normally in that space, and then to have it just be blasted all over the media through violence and hatred. So a couple of weeks after the events had unfolded and all the news vehicles were gone, my sister-in-law, who was a Girl Scout leader at the time, took her troop down to the pedestrian mall, and a local florist had given them flowers, and they handed out flowers to people in the pedestrian mall that day. It was a symbolic action saying this can be a place of beauty and connection and safety for our community again. Preaching can be an act of compassionate witness. So creating the sermon itself can often be a response to those glancing blows that we in our congregation are experiencing in the world. You can also use the sermon as a means to amplify other acts of compassionate witness that you see in the world. So, I'm not sure if I had more of these. No, I didn't. Okay. All right. So one of the foundations that underlies a lot of Cato Weingarten's work is this concept of reasonable hope. And I do want to also kind of acknowledge the caveat that yes, as Christians, our hope is also somewhat unreasonable because Jesus was raised from the dead, and this is like an unreasonable experience. So I do want to acknowledge that theologically. But I love this concept of reasonable hope because I feel like it allows us to manageably work at our faith in difficult situations. So hope can exist alongside doubt, brokenness, and despair. These things are not mutually exclusive. All of these things live together, and that's part of what it is to be a human. Reasonable hope engages the here and now, and it is very difficult to stay in the present moment when you've experienced either a trauma or even these common shock experiences. To view hope as a verb rather than a noun. So hope is not something you either have or you don't have, or I'm all out of hope, I need to get some more hope and put it in my hope bucket. Like that's not how it works. Hope is a muscle that you can work on over time. And if you are struggling with your hope muscle, the people around you can help you with your hope muscle. So hope is something that we do together. Having an intentionally limited horizon of expectation. So again, this is part about staying in the present moment. You're not looking too far ahead. You're saying what can be done here and now. And knowing that you can't do everything. You cannot do everything. We are finite. We are human. But you can do something. And small acts are not trivial. So here are some principles and practices for church leaders. And I just want to give a shout out to chaplains. Chaplains live in this zone much of the time. So chaplains are doing these things all the time. So if you have chaplain friends, allow them to help you if you need help with some of these tools. So you want to work with moving your people toward a goal rather than a feeling. So toward doing hope rather than feeling something necessarily. And you can help by envisioning clear steps and then helping people to act on those steps to say, okay, so we want to do this. What is step number 1 in that process? Okay, now it's time for step number 2 in that process. Listening without your own agenda. And again, this is so hard. So it is really important for everyone who is in these caregiving roles and pastoral leadership to have someone to whom you can tell your agenda and who can help you processing your own agenda so that you are able to kind of bracket that off as best you can. Being open to sorrow and finding connection in loss. That's a really big point of empathy connection, so being open to that experience. Again, attending to the present. That's part of that limited horizon so that we have something manageable and reasonable, a step that we can do. Resting in uncertainty. As much as we want closure, often human life does not have good closure. Like, life just unfolds, and you have to get comfortable with sort of resting in that sense that we may never have kind of the happy ending that we want to have surrounding a particular event or circumstance. I cannot remember where the quote came from, but there's this quote, "Traveler, the path is made by walking." So you're figuring it out as you go. So there isn't going to be necessarily like a beautiful rainbow or a sunset at the end of the journey. And then believing that there is always something that can be sustaining. So while you can't do everything, there is something, even in the most difficult circumstances, that can be sustaining. So here's more examples, and these all come from kind of the COVID era, the intense COVID era. So people making masks during COVID, a lot of folks made masks and delivered them to their neighbors, left them on their porches. Whole communities did this together. Getting groceries for those at risk, like checking around, saying, is someone picking up things for our neighbors so they don't have to go put themselves at risk. Chalk messages of hope. So in our neighborhood, a lot of people would write like, "There is hope," or "I love you," like on the chalk in front of their house. And it was meaningful, like it was something, it wasn't nothing. At my kids' school, the teachers made big signs that they put in the windows of the school, and it was really powerful because the school year had ended so abruptly, there was no closure, and to have like these messages from the teachers was really meaningful. Marching in the streets, we saw this after George Floyd was murdered, we saw this recently with Tyree Nichols, like a sense of response, like we need to come out and be together and make our sense of protest known. Attending a Black Lives Matter rally, it's another response that we have when we experience violence. There's a family in our neighborhood that has 6 children, and they were deeply troubled, as we all were, when George Floyd was murdered, and they were not able to go to a Black Lives Matter rally. They had many young children, and so what they did, actually, is they got their wagon out, and they delivered those Crayola Colors of the World crayons to all the houses in our neighborhood, and it was something that the kids could do, which I really loved because it was tapping into something that was super concrete, but also it was this response of compassionate witness. So often when bad things happen, politicians and other leaders will say, "Our thoughts and prayers are with those who have suffered this." And one of the horrible after effects of this is that now thoughts and prayers, especially prayers, this hurts, as a person of faith, are viewed as a substitution for any kind of actual action that's going to change a terrible situation or a broken or corrupt system. And so I feel like in our world, prayer is now viewed as this kind of like lame Band-Aid that isn't really doing anything. But as believers, we know this is not the case, that prayer actually is something that we are doing and that it has far-reaching impact. And so I'm going to work with prayer as a means of compassionate witness, because prayer is something that we have in our toolkit as Christians that we can do with our congregations and ourselves and our families. So we're going to return to the basic form of the lament psalm. So the lament as a form of compassionate witness, something that you can do with your congregation in the aftermath of an event, or even like whether it's a mass trauma that you've experienced directly or a glancing blow that you've experienced from our world. So again, the first part of the lament psalm is emphasizing the covenant relationship with God and the people's right to asking God to act. So it's an address of God. It's personal. Then the second part is the lament, the petition, and God's motivation. So naming the pain, appealing to God, naming reasons for God to intervene, such as God's past intervention or maintaining God's good reputation. And then finally, praise that God has heard and thankfulness for God's action. Here is Psalm 6, so we can trace these movements through Psalm 6. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. My soul also is struck with terror, while you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, save my life, deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. They grow weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and struck with terror. They shall turn back and in a moment be put to shame. So you should also have these prompts on a handout that I think you got. So in case this is too tiny for you to read, I apologize for the tininess. I realized last week that I'm used to working in kind of a more imminent frame, like the Zoom frame, and not always in a bigger setting where things are projected as of late. And so I'm like, oh, this is really small. So you have it with you in case you can't read these. So these are just a way of walking you through if you want to create your own lament psalm, either individually or in a group. So thinking about what names you use for God, how do you feel most comfortable speaking to the divine? What is your complaint? What is bothering you? What hurts? Where is the pain in your life or our world? What specifically do you long for God to do for you, for others, for our world? Where is justice needed? How can God level the scales and uplift those who have been on the receiving end of sin and brokenness? How do you need God to bring vindication through dealing directly with individuals, groups, or systems that have caused harm? How has God been present to you in the past? What do you know about who God is? How does God give you hope in the present? And then finally, imagine God's justice, comfort, power, love, and presence. Imagine God as a mother lion and you as her cub. Imagine tender care and fierce defense. Recall Jesus' actions of healing, feeding, listening, questioning assumptions, and teaching new ways. If you have the words, feel free to share words of praise or thankfulness. So that kind of walks you through it a bit. And I've got an example here that I'm going to read for you. So we do this in my worship classes. We have sessions where we're working on writing different styles of prayer, and often I have a pastor come in and work with us, and they can talk about how they work with prayer in their own congregation. And so we did this last year, and it was right around this time, actually. The war in Ukraine had just started, and everyone was extremely fraught and upset. So a lot of our lamenting had centered around that event. So the pastor who was with us, worked with us, it's Brian McGuire. He's a Presbyterian pastor in our community. And then he went back to his church office and he ruminated more, and then he created a prayer of lament that he sent out to his congregation. And then I got permission from him to use it in a few settings. So here is his prayer of lament for the people of Ukraine. God of the suffering and the forgotten, God of fearful and fleeing, God of the cross, you never employed empires or armies, but make yourself known in the most humble moments of gentle care. You know that history is not drawn on maps, but in the interwoven tapestry of people's hearts. We go about our daily lives and complain about the price of fuel, and a child hurriedly packs a single suitcase for a lifetime. An old man gets lost in the panicked crowds of the train station. A dog sniffs at the bowl in its yard to which its owners may never return. Fear begins to creep over the city like a cold, damp stain, blotting out life as hatred vies with terror for supremacy. Let loose your better angels, O Lord. Shield and guide your people who pray more fervently than we can imagine in our secure rest. Show yourself now in word and deed, in miracles and mundane. Rouse up your heroes and stir the hearts of the multitude so your kingdom may be made manifest amid the rack and ruin of our vanities. Remind leaders everywhere that they stand under your judgment for eternity. And most of all, remember the one we forget, the one of no account, the one without money, fame, or followers, who runs into the night alone and afraid. You know your child by name, even when we do not. Save your child, O God, from the scourge of war let loose by evil men. All our hopes and all our ends lie in you. Your light shines still, even in the darkness. Amen. So that is lament. Now, kind of mentally allow yourself a little pause, because blessing is another way that you can attend to these kind of collateral wounds that we experience in our world. And there's a number of different approaches. I touched on this some the other night in terms of how you would go about writing a blessing. So you can start with God. You can talk about who God is and who we are. May the God or the Spirit who acknowledges our relationship with God, rather than reducing prayer to a kind of transaction. You can also start with human experience. Blessed are they, or the one who, so the experience that people are having. And then that brings God's presence and power to bear. It makes it present in a situation where human experience and human agency need to be affirmed and supported. And finally, you can ask for God's intervention in areas of need and bear witness to signs of new life. So this is something that I've used with my classes as well. You can create kind of two columns, like where do we see God acting and where do we wish that God would act? Where do we desire God's presence in our world? And then use those kind of experiences to design a prayer of blessing, where you're inviting both intervention and thanking God for God's presence in situations where we have seen like healing or restoration or signs of new life. And often I think it works best if you would use this with your congregation to give it to them as a prompt earlier so that they can do some thinking and reflecting, and then maybe invite them to participate that in a time of prayer where people just call out these things, and then keep track and turn these into a prayer that can be prayed as the pastoral prayer. So here's the information for Kata Weingarten, but again, if you Google her, you can find her pretty easily. And her book that a lot of this is laid out in some detail is called Common Shock, and I commend that. It's a very accessible resource.